What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the reboot of Hellboy starring David Harbour and Milla Jovovich. If you're worried about spoilers, not to worry, I won't give anything away until I give you proper fair warning. But as you've probably heard already, this movie has been getting absolutely torn to pieces by most critics. I didn't let that bother me in the least. These days I seem to be increasingly out of step with most critics, so I went into this movie with my head held high. And to my horror, the theater was completely empty except for one couple. That I did not expect at all. Granted, Hellboy is not exactly Superman in terms of popularity, but an empty theater on opening night in New York is practically unheard of. I genuinely hope that folks are not avoiding this movie due to the low score on Rotten Tomatoes, which last time I checked was hovering around 11%. Personally, I always try and push people toward Metacritic, which I think does a better job of capturing nuance in critics' reviews, but this movie is vastly more entertaining than so many bland, forgettable mediocrities that routinely get 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. That said, I also have to admit that this movie is a wildly inconsistent mess with loads of problems, so I totally get why it left some folks scratching their heads. This movie has tons of exposition, and it comes fast and furious, and the story features nearly wall-to-wall horrific R-rated gore and brutality, so obviously it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. Most viewers are not accustomed to horror and superheroes being stirred together in such a concentrated brew, but in my opinion, when the movie works, it really works. In a nutshell, the story follows Hellboy as he tries to save the world from a witch who desires to burn everything down and start over from scratch. But as Hellboy is reminded that he's fighting against his own kind to protect a world that hates and fears him, his path forward becomes increasingly difficult to navigate. I've devoted a decent chunk of my life to devouring comics, and I've actually got the first 5 trade paperbacks of Hellboy right here, stories that I consider to be absolute, total, complete masterpieces that deserve to be mentioned in the same breath with any classic comics from any era by any creators. But I've noticed a strange phenomenon lately where the success of comic book movie adaptations has not made the world of film and television more like comics. Instead, what Hollywood tends to do is they shave the weird, rough edges off of wildly original work and try and make it feel more like conventional entertainment and more accessible to general audiences. I completely, utterly despise this trend, and very rarely do I see an adaptation that tries to stay true to its roots. This movie, in spite of its many flaws, at least has the courage of its convictions and tries to do a fucking R-rated Hellboy story instead of turning the concept into more PG-13 disposable bubblegum that's designed to be spat out the moment it loses its flavor. Initially, I was skeptical when I heard that this franchise was being rebooted. As far as I'm concerned, even if a filmmaker or star decides to move on to other projects, I feel like most franchises should always try to keep pushing forward instead of retelling an origin story that will likely still be fresh on a lot of people's minds. But when I learned that screenwriter Andrew Cosby and director Neil Marshall would be drawing their inspiration from 3 key story arcs, Darkness Calls, The Wild Hunt, and The Storm and the Fury, that got my attention. While I will always lean toward the early Hellboy comics that were both written and drawn by Mike Mignola, I have to admit that the art by Duncan Fegredo in these 3 collections is absolutely astonishing, and these 3 stories are some of my favorite comics in recent memory. I totally get it if folks feel loyal to Guillermo del Toro and Ron Perlman, but I would urge fans of Hellboy at a minimum to read these 3 collections and to consider giving this movie a try. First and foremost, David Harbour is one hell of a good Hellboy. I think he's actually better than Ron Perlman, and he just nails it every step of the way. His attitude, his sense of humor, the way he looks, the way he moves in combat, everything is just straight up perfect. But what I really enjoyed about this movie was its epic scale, as well as the truly deranged sensibility of the action in the story. Whether Hellboy's duking it out with 3 rampaging giants in an absolutely wild sequence, or learning about the past adventures of Lobster Johnson, or experiencing a vision of an apocalyptic future where Hellboy leads an army of demons to destroy the world, the movie completely, utterly leans into and is unafraid of the myth, legends, and fantasy that make Mike Mignola's comics so extraordinary. The monster design alone is some of the most jaw-droppingly disgusting stuff I've seen in years. But the flip side of this is that there are plenty of scenes where the movie just feels incoherent and sloppy, bordering on chaotic. If I wasn't familiar with the source material, I imagine I might have checked out a few times due to exposition overload. Because there's enough plot and story here for an entire trilogy of movies, and I wish Neil Marshall and Andrew Cosby would have taken their time, slowed things down, and just tried to get the franchise back on firm footing so that we could look forward to more Hellboy movies every couple of years. The end of the film and the post-credit teasers perfectly set up so many fantastic future storylines, but if the reviews and the empty theaters are any indication of how this movie is going to be received, we might not see another attempt at Hellboy for many years to come, and that'll probably end up being a reboot. There's also a lot of wasted talent here. here. While the cast is absolutely first rate, sadly neither Ian McShane nor Mila Jovovich are given any great material to work with. All the best lines and all the best dramatic beats belong to David Harbour. Daniel Dave Kim and Sasha Lane at least have a lot of screen time, but their characters also suffer from being a little one-dimensional. Even more crippling is the fact that the special effects are wildly uneven throughout the movie. Some of the monsters involved are some of the eeriest kick-ass creatures I've ever seen on screen, while others look like they were just thrown together in a matter of minutes. Too much of this movie just feels like a rush job. So that's about all I can say without getting into spoilers, so now's the time to jump ship if that's a concern for you, but I do want to call attention to a few specific details before wrapping up this review, because there's one lengthy scene in this movie that absolutely floored me. My favorite scene by far is when Hellboy meets Merlin, and Merlin urges Hellboy to claim Excalibur. After learning that he's a descendant of King Arthur and that his human mother made love to a demon, Hellboy sees this vision of the future where he's riding on the back of a skeletal dragon with Excalibur in hand and a flaming crown over his head with his horns all jacked out, and he's got this vast army of demons and undead swarming over the surface of the planet. It absolutely blew my mind. It was like taking the Bible's book of Revelations and like stirring it together with H.P. Lovecraft. It was a moment when the imagination of the filmmakers just got completely, totally unleashed, and the final result was absolutely beautiful to behold. Hellboy ultimately rejects this path, but I love seeing Hellboy's inner turmoil as he tries to decide if he should protect humanity or give in to the temptation of living among his own kind. Because it's not like the creatures of myth and legend in this movie are depicted in some sort of sympathetic, soft and fuzzy light. During a sit-down with Baba Yaga herself, she tries to serve Hellboy a bowl of soup made from the body parts of human children. The bowl's filled with like guts and fingers, and Hellboy looks over his shoulder and sees that these children are hanging upside down in a room like animals that have been recently slaughtered. For audience members who expect every comic book movie to be like Shazam, I imagine this scene will be rather unexpected. I can't emphasize enough just how graphic this movie is, whether you see the Blood Queen crushing her treacherous sisters in a sickening fashion, or you're watching grotesque monstrosities as they rampage through the streets of London, mutilating everybody in sight. This movie absolutely leans all the way in on its R rating, and for that, I applaud this movie. But unless this movie suddenly develops a massive cult following or becomes a giant runaway hit in another country, I fear that this movie is about to become a massive flop. And of course, Hollywood would look at the failure of this movie and immediately second-guess any R-rated comic book adaptations that are currently in development. That makes me really frustrated. Of course, PG-13 family-friendly superhero movies will always have a role to play in the entertainment landscape, but I don't want those to be the only movies Hollywood is interested in making. And as somebody who grew up in the 80s, when the floodgates were open, where all kinds of hardcore R-rated entertainment were readily available, I get really sad and depressed when I see that Hollywood's only interested in stories that have been kind of child-proofed for the entire world so that nobody could possibly be upset or offended by them. I foolishly allowed myself to believe that both Deadpool and Logan were going to be trendsetters and total game changers for Hollywood, but if anything, the opposite is proven to be true. So as a personal favor to me, if you've ever liked the character of Hellboy on the page or on the screen, at least consider giving this film a chance. I can't promise a great movie-going experience from start to finish, but I can promise you that at different points throughout the movie, you will see some absolutely wild shit before the journey is complete. At any rate, I think I've banged the drum enough at this point for this movie. Obviously, I enjoyed it to a degree, but more importantly, I enjoyed what the movie signifies, or at least the risk that the filmmakers were willing to take, and I hope we'll see more filmmakers taking those risks in the future. But for now, if you enjoyed this reaction and review, please consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to talk about Hellboy or horror or superheroes or whatever, the best place to reach me is on Twitter at Colbrax, and there's a link in the description below. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. Thanks so much for watching my video, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.